Today's book is Claudius the God by Robert Graves. This is actually a sequel to another book called I, Claudius, also by Robert Graves. There is a lot to talk about here, so advance warning, I'm probably going to ramble on for a long time. I anticipate that I'm going to get cut off somewhere because the camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit when it automatically shuts down after 30 minutes. And I tend to be long-winded and there's a lot of stuff to get into. So, advance warning. Right, so this is a sequel to the book I, Claudius, also by Robert Graves. Both of these books came out in the 1930s. I believe I, Claudius came out in 1934. Claudius the God came out the year later in 1935. So the fact that they're still being printed and sold in bookstores, I think, indicates that they're classics at this point. I think they're old enough to have survived the test of time. So these books are historical fiction. And I don't know what the exact word is for this, but they're like what I like to call hard historical fiction. In the sense, it's not just kind of like, history isn't just kind of a vague backdrop here. Like, all the characters are real historical figures. Robert Graves has kind of gone through the histories and kind of researched everything, and he's changed it into the form of a novel. But what he is doing is he's essentially taking the old Roman histories and just retelling them in the form of a novel. I have long been a fan of this type of book. I don't know, just the way my brain is wired or whatever. I'm a history buff. I've always really loved Roman history, but I have limited patience for kind of slogging through the original text. I much prefer kind of getting it in the form of a novel. I know this is a personal preference. Some people like historical novels, some people don't. But I've always been a Roman history buff, but I'd be somewhat embarrassed to tell you how much of my knowledge of Roman history just comes through novels like these. Now, both of these novels are about the Emperor Claudius, but they kind of cover the whole span of the Julio-Claudian emperors. So Augustus Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, Caligula Caesar, or Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Nero just kind of very briefly at the very end. So these are, I guess if you don't know, these are the kind of first 5 emperors, kind of after Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar kind of doesn't count almost because he wasn't, he was the first kind of Roman emperor, kind of, but then Augustus was really the first one who kind of established the dynasty. We know a lot about them because, ancient sources like to write about them, so we've got a lot of history about them. Also, the time period here coincides with the New Testament. So, for example, Augustus was emperor when Jesus was born. Tiberius was emperor when Jesus was crucified. Claudius and Nero were kind of the emperors during the age of the apostles, when Peter and Paul were going out. According to church tradition, Paul and Peter, I think, were killed under Emperor Nero. So, growing up, I grew up in a Christian environment. I went to Sunday school. I also went to private Christian schools where we had, studied Bible as a subject. So this was kind of my first foray into ancient history, was through the lens of the Bible. I had one Bible teacher in particular in kind of 7th and 8th grade who was very good. He was an ancient history buff just like I was. And, we'd be going through the book of Acts, and he'd be very good at kind of making these connections between the historical figures that were popping up in the book of Acts and kind of the larger Greco-Roman world. So, yeah, all of that is just kind of background as to why I was so interested in this. I picked up I, Claudius way back when I was in high school. I think I was in 10th, 11th grade. I don't remember exactly. I'm 40 years old now. So that 25 years ago now, I read I, Claudius. Obviously, the memory has faded somewhat, so take everything I have to say with a grain of salt. Although I feel like the stuff I read in high school, I was younger and it made more of an impression on me, and I remember it a lot better than the stuff I've read since. I think that's fairly common for most people. Anyways, the plot of I, Claudius it's the story of kind of the Julio-Claudian dynasty as told through the eyes of Claudius. So it's written as like Claudius's autobiography. The historical Claudius really did write an autobiography that's since been lost to history, but this is just kind of Robert Graves' reimagining of it. And it's interesting for a couple reasons. So Claudius is kind of an interesting figure. He had kind of the royal blood, but he was the last person you would ever expect to become emperor because, number one, there were so many people in line before him who had better claims. And number two, he was deformed. He was lame. He had a speech impediment. He had trouble giving public speeches. He couldn't, because he had been born deformed with like a club foot or something like that. He couldn't march out and kind of win the battles that you needed to win to kind of, rise in politics in the ancient world, right? Because you needed to be a great general first before you kind of got a lot of these political offices, usually. But yeah, the weird thing about the Julio-Claudian emperors is kind of all the people who were in line before him died. And some of them died just, naturally, like, they got sick and died, or old age or whatever. And some of them died because of kind of the politics and the squabbling and, were falsely accused, or the emperor killed him because he didn't like him or something like that. So there's this whole trail of deaths that, that leads to kind of Claudius eventually becoming emperor. Now, what Robert Graves does with the historical fiction is he imagines that all of these deaths were being orchestrated by Livia, Augustus's wife, who was kind of scheming to get her own son Tiberius to the throne. So even the deaths that were natural, like people who died of sickness, in Robert Graves's version, it wasn't actually sickness. They were secretly poisoned by Livia. I think a lot of that is kind of his imagination, Robert Graves' imagination. There is, I don't know. I've not actually kind of read the ancient sources myself. I had a Latin professor in university who kind of dismissed the idea. He said, that's just fiction, the idea that Livia was behind all of this. Although I think some of these deaths were actually, in kind of the official records, Augustus or Tiberius did actually sentence this person to die. But, some of these other deaths were just kind of imagined. So when you read I, Claudius, it's, as far as I can remember, there's kind of a gripping tension to the narrative. It's almost kind of like a horror story, because there are all these kind of nice, perfectly respectable people who you've grown to like, and they're just one by one, they kind of get killed off. Kind of Claudius's whole extended family just kind of gradually gets killed off. So there's that kind of tension to the narrative, and then, it kind of ends with Claudius, the most unlikely person of all, becoming emperor. The other thing that makes it interesting is just kind of all the soap opera stuff. Now, a lot of I, Claudius is based on the work of Suetonius, who was a Roman historian who wrote this book called 12 Caesars. which I've not read it, so I only know it by reputation. But it's got a reputation for kind of including all these juicy, salacious details about, the scandalous lives of all the Caesars. And I think there's some skepticism about modern historians about how much of this is kind of true and how much of this is just kind of, gossip and stuff like that got incorporated into history. But Robert Graves kind of treats it as history, which I think, if you're writing a historical fiction, fair enough. It's not the job of a novelist to kind of go through and sift through which of the ancient sources are exaggerating, which of them aren't. Somebody writing historical fiction can just take the ancient sources at face value. It's not the novelist's job to kind of try and evaluate them. I think some of the critics of I, Claudius kind of accused Robert Graves of only using Suetonius and Tacitus. So in the beginning of Claudius the God, he kind of hits back with kind of a long list. Says, some people said I only use Suetonius and Tacitus, but I use all these authors. And he just kind of lists all the authors he's consulted here. It goes on about for like a page and a half about all the authors he's consulted. Robert Graves was a classicist, so like he knew his stuff. He could read Latin, he could read Greek. He was consulting all the ancient sources in their original language. Again, these books came out in the 1930s, so he was kind of like of that last generation of kind of British people who's got taught Latin and Greek in their school days. What was I talking about? All right, so kind of all the gossipy details are in I, Claudius. And I, Claudius, so it's interesting reading, and I, Claudius ends right at the moment Claudius becomes emperor. And as far as memory serves, I really enjoyed it when I read it in high school. Now, Claudius the God picks up right where I, Claudius, leaves off. So Claudius has just become emperor at the end of I, Claudius, and then Claudius the God is about Claudius's reign as emperor. I never read this in high school, largely because I didn't even know it existed. Our school library only had I, Claudius. They never had Claudius the God. I think it was a few years later before I even realized that there was a sequel. And then I wasn't able to track it down for several years. Like back in the 90s, it wasn't as easy to track down books as it is now. So I've been curious to read it for quite some time, but just never got around to it, never tracked it down. Sorry, while I'm giving background, one more thing. These novels were also made into a BBC drama. It's called I, Claudius, but actually the BBC drama is actually about both I, Claudius and Claudius the God. It came out in 1976. I forget when exactly I first heard about it. I read about it somewhere on the internet, and when I read about it, I really wanted to see it at the time. But it was, it was really hard to track down. And again, kind of back in the 1990s, it was a lot harder to track down this stuff than it is now. Nowadays, everything is just on the internet somewhere. I eventually did track this down a couple years ago. I got it at a pirated DVD store in Cambodia, of all places, and watched it. And it's quite watchable. It's from 1976, but it still holds up pretty well. Like the sets don't hold up at all. So like if this had been made today, they'd have all these elaborate sets and they'd recreate Rome with CGI and stuff like that. This was the 1970s, and it was a British production in the 1970s. So they just had no budget at all. So everything's just like on a stage indoors, and it doesn't, you can completely tell it's all filmed indoors on a stage. But what they did a good job of is just kind of taking all the juicy soap opera stuff out of the Claudius drama, and just kind of, hamming it up and making a real kind of soap opera out of it. And it goes on for, I don't remember, 8 episodes or 8 hours or something like that. And if you can track down a copy, it's incredibly watchable, even though the sets and production design is really dated. It's also got a lot of famous people in it. It's got Patrick Stewart back when he was much younger. It's got Brian Blessed in it. It's got, I forget, Brian Jacoby was the name of the, it's got a bunch, Derek Jacoby, it's got a bunch of famous people in it. Okay, so just now getting around to reading Claudius the God. Because, well, yeah, largely because I've never come across it before. And then I was in a bookstore in Cambodia. I'm living out in Vietnam now. And I saw these books on the shelf and I thought, there it is. I never got around to reading it. And I bought it. I took it back with me to Vietnam. In Vietnam, it's harder to track down English books than it is in Phnom Penh for whatever reason. And then I got back and I thought, shoot, I should have bought I, Claudius at the same bookstore, because I was long overdue for rereading I, Claudius. I hadn't read it since I was in high school. That was like 25 years ago now. I thought I should refresh my mind with it before I jump into Claudius the God. So I thought, okay, well, I don't know when I'm going to next get back to Phnom Penh, but I'll just put this book on my shelf and just kind of wait. And I waited for about a year, and then I just thought one day, you know what? Either I'm going to read it now or I'm never going to read it. You know, I could just see where this is one of those things where I was just kind of putting it off and putting it off, waiting around till I kind of finally tracked down I, Claudius. So I just picked this up and read it, and my reviewing this is going to be a little bit handicapped because the original I, Claudius is kind of faded in my memory a bit. So I can't kind of compare the two. But I can review this one well enough. As much as this kind of stands independently. Sorry, I know I'm really rambling here. It's taken me I don't know how many minutes just to kind of set up the fact that I've finally gotten around to reading this book. Sorry. Okay. So anyways, I'd already seen the BBC production. Being a history buff, I kind of knew the history anyway, so I knew largely where this was going. But, you know, it's just kind of a pleasure kind of to read a retelling of it. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this rant that kind of one of my first forays into this, or kind of openings of interest, was kind of my New Testament Bible class, where the teacher would kind of make these connections between the people in the New Testament and the larger Roman history. Well, this book actually starts off with a long description of Herod Agrippa from the New Testament. So there's a connection right there. Now, if you don't have a strong Bible background, who was Herod Agrippa? So yeah, there are, in the New Testament, the name Herod pops up a lot, but it's not always the same Herod. And it's a little bit confusing because there was this whole family of Herods. There's Herod the Great, and then there were his sons, and there's grandsons and nephews and cousins or whatever, and they were all named Herod. So this gets a little bit confusing, but there was the Herod in the Christmas story. This was Herod the Great. Right, he's the guy who was trying to kill baby Jesus, and he sent his soldiers to massacre all the babies in Bethlehem. And then there is Herod Antipas. This was a different Herod. This was the Herod that killed John the Baptist. And this was also the Herod that was at the trial of Jesus, right? When Pilate sent Jesus off to be tried by Herod, and then Herod had sent him back to Pilate. That was this Herod. Then there is Herod Agrippa. Now, Herod Agrippa is the one in this book. Herod Agrippa is also the Herod in Acts. He's the one who kills James, son of Zebedee, and imprisons Peter. And then one day, according to the book of Acts, he's wearing this nice suit and the light's reflecting off of him. And everyone says, oh, he looks like a god. And he didn't say anything, and then God got mad and struck him down with worms, and he died painfully with worms. So that's all from the book of Acts. I know I'm really rambling here, but I'm going to go on a little small digression. Just indulge me on this. Always confused me in Sunday school. Yeah, James, son of Zebedee, had been one of Jesus' main disciples, right? There were Peter, James, and John. These were the three main disciples. All throughout the Synoptic Gospels, it keeps talking about these three main disciples. Then all of a sudden you get to the book of Acts, and James just gets killed as an aside. It says something like, then Herod Agrippa killed James, son of Zebedee. And when he saw how much this pleased the Jews, he also imprisoned Peter. And then the rest of the story is just about Peter getting imprisoned. And you're like, wait. James got killed? Well, how come we don't get more details about that? And it's especially confusing because the author of Acts can do big death scenes when he wants to. Like Stephen the martyr, who wasn't even one of the main disciples, gets this long death scene where he sees this vision as he's getting stoned, and you have all this kind of stuff. But then James, who had been one of the most important disciples kind of all throughout the Gospels, just as an aside, just as, oh, by the way, I don't know. I don't think, I was going to say, if anyone knows why that was, let me know. But it's probably one of those things where there is no explanation. It's just kind of one of those strange things about the Bible. Anyways, that's this Herod, the Herod who had done those things in the book of Acts. Now, he had actually shown up in the BBC series. He kind of young Herod Agrippa being educated with Claudius. And I remember when I watched that, and I thought, that's strange. I don't remember Herod Agrippa being a character, but then again, it was ages ago that I read the original I, Claudius. Maybe I just forgot it. But this book starts out, and the narrator, it's Claudius because it's kind of first-person narration. Claudius himself is narrating. Says, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about Herod Agrippa. Let me just go back and tell that story. He said, the reason I didn't tell it in my previous volume is because I didn't want to kind of break the thematic unity by having Herod's story spread out over 2 volumes. I suspect the real reason is that Robert Graves just forgot to include it. But yeah, it's really bizarre, the story about Herod Agrippa. It turns out Herod Agrippa had kind of grown up with Claudius and Caligula and kind of the royal family in Rome. And had kind of been part of some of these palace intrigues, and had been a good drinking buddy of Tiberius's son, and had been imprisoned by Tiberius, and had been a good friend of Caligula, and all this kind of stuff. And then, right at the moment when Caligula is being killed, has been killed, and Claudius is becoming emperor, it turns out Herod Agrippa played this huge central part in it, where he goes to the Senate and he kind of says, all right, let's be rational here. Let's not declare a republic just yet. Let's hear what Claudius has to say. Herod Agrippa kind of negotiates between Claudius and the Senate, and is really instrumental in that fateful moment when Claudius becomes emperor. And I thought, this can't be true. I thought, Robert Graves is exaggerating the importance of Herod Agrippa because Robert Graves knows that his audience, has read the book of Acts. Remember, this was back in the 1930s when people were a lot more Bible literate than they are now. So he's kind of playing on this connection people have with it from their Sunday school days and exaggerating the importance of it and stuff like that. But then I go to Wikipedia and, yeah, turns out it is all true. A lot of this comes from Josephus, who was a Jewish source, but also Cassius Dio, who was like I believe a Greek source, a Roman source, or he was a secular source at any rate. Herod Agrippa from the book of Acts really did grow up with Claudius and Caligula and was really tight with Tiberius' son, and did play a fateful moment in that time when Claudius was declared emperor, of negotiating between the Senate and the bodyguards and stuff like that. Yeah, who knew? Just one of those kind of interesting connections between kind of real history and the Bible. Anyways, the book starts off with, I think, a few chapters kind of going through the history of Herod Agrippa. And the reason for this is because Herod Agrippa is going to play a big part in this volume, and for whatever reason, Robert Graves didn't write about him at all in the previous volume, so he's going to kind of go through now and give Herod Agrippa's history. And this is a little bit of a strange way to start out the book, because, you know, the previous book had ended right when kind of Claudius is becoming emperor. Now you're kind of reading this book, and you're like, what are we doing this long digression on Herod's backstory? Like, get back to Claudius and him becoming emperor. And yet it's interesting as far as it goes, and again, kind of going to Wikipedia, does seem to check out. There's some invention going on here, but that's what you expect with a historical novel. Most of it is kind of straight out of history. Then we get to Claudius becoming emperor and Herod Agrippa kind of interceding with him, for him with the Senate. Then the book is off and kind of running. Right, so this book, I'm going to confess, there were patches of it that I found boring. And I was really looking forward to this book because I knew from kind of my other sources and from the BBC production that Claudius had a lot of trouble with his wives. And there's like a real lot of soap opera stuff here with his wives plotting against him, and one wife kind of launching a coup against him, and the other wife kind of poisoning him. And so I thought that was going to be kind of the main part of the book. And it is a big part of the book, but there's also a lot of stuff in here about Claudius's reforms and kind of his tax reforms, is kind of building a harbor for the grain to come into Italy. There's a lot of stuff written about that. Is draining a lake to make more arable land. Building an aqueduct. And again, it kind of all comes from the history. I've looked this up on Wikipedia to kind of double check it. Although I kind of knew it was all from the history anyways, because it was so boring. There was no reason why Robert Graves would possibly invent it. But yeah, a lot of kind of, well, I don't know. I guess it depends what you want out of a novel. If you're a real history buff and you're reading these historical novels to learn history, which I guess is why people pick them up, then I guess you probably do want to kind of know all the boring stuff about the harbor that Claudius built and some of his tax reforms and stuff like that. Robert Graves is a talented enough writer that the prose does kind of flow, and you never get to I never got to like an impasse where I couldn't read it. It just wasn't as interesting as I thought it was going to be, I guess. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, I wonder if maybe Claudius wasn't quite as interesting as I remember it. And I'm beginning to think maybe parts of Claudius could kind of flag a little bit, and I just don't remember them. Or maybe the memory's coming back to me now a bit. I don't know. It's always dangerous kind of reviewing a book you've read 25 years ago. That being said, the soap opera stuff does kick in eventually, kind of near the end of the book mostly. Claudius's one of his wives has been kind of unfaithful to him. Now, the BBC production, if you watch that, they kind of, the first half is kind of based on I, Claudius. The second half is based on Claudius the God.